Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I'm sharing with you another conversation with Ben Kintisch, who's been joining me in a new series on death and grief and pop culture. Today, we're talking about the musical Hamilton, which was a really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. Even if you haven't seen Hamilton, I think you'll enjoy listening in to what we have to say about that musical. So make sure you've subscribed using the link down below. Also, leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. And you can go to eoluniversity.com/support, and you'll find 3 different ways you can make a small financial contribution that will help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. So now we'll move on to my conversation with Ben Kintisch. Today, I am very happy to welcome back my recurring guest, Benjamin Kintisch, who is the co-host with me of our series on death, dying, and grief in pop culture. And we're excited to be doing another episode in that series. Just as a reminder, I'll tell you a little bit about Ben. He is a cantor, a chaplain, and a music teacher when he's not performing on stage. And he is also the creator and composer of the future Broadway smash hit Life Review, the Hospice Musical. And I'm putting this out there so that anyone from Broadway who listens to the podcast will want to look up Life Review, the Hospice Musical. This is how I think it might work, but I don't know. I have no idea. But you can
You
learn
never know
more.
who's listening,
I
Karen.
know,
I
you
like
never
the
know.
style.
You can learn more about Ben and the musical at lifereviewmusical.com. So, Ben, welcome back again.
Hey, thanks so much, Karen, for that introduction, as well as for sharing information about my show. I am so delighted to be part of this ongoing series on your podcast, um, both because I love talking with you and because the topics that we've settled on, uh, theater, music, and movies, are 3 things that I love. I love theater, I love movies, I love music, and as both my wife and child will tell you, I love death and dying and grief. So here
Wow.
we are talking about it. It's great.
Here it is, tailor made. And we were just saying how great it is that we're going to have all positive messages here, but we're talking about the heaviest, most difficult subjects for most people. But we're modeling that it's possible to have a positive outlook even when we're talking about hard things.
Well, for sure, a lot of times people are puzzled with the topic matter for my play because it's a musical comedy set in a residential hospice facility. I explain that we follow that old adage from Mary Poppins: it takes a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down, right? So, in many musical comedies, to be specific to that genre, we see the use of comedy, that key half of musical comedy. Comedy gives us a chance to um, play our way through some difficult terrain, right? You don't need a comedy number to get through a sunny day or puppies or falling in love. In fact, rare is the good comedy number about falling in love. If you think about it, love songs tend to be straight up sentimental, emotional because they're not inherently uncomfortable. Whereas um, most of my favorite comedy songs are in areas that are a little bit taboo, a little bit uncomfortable. So we see that all over the place in musical theater. Certainly, a lot of my funniest songs deal with uncomfortable topics. And the hope for me is just to get people playing and a little bit more relaxed. I mean, when my composer friend Jason Spiewak and I first came up with the idea for our opening number, spoiler alert, it was basically because Jason said people are going to be coming into the theater stressed and nervous about the topic matter. So you need to have an opening number that breaks the ice. So it has to be funny. So that was our first job. It wasn't
Mm.
necessarily to teach. We just came up with a very good punchline. It's spoiler alert, colon, everybody dies in the end. And so that has a specific meaning for the play as well as a bigger life meaning. And I'll tell you, I've never sung this song without getting big laughs. It's always a punchline that hits. Um, so so that's good for our little spot, but we um we keep laughing through the difficult stuff because saying it straight up, okay, attention everyone in the audience, we're all dying and we're all mortal and buckle your seatbelt. That would just like make people feel uncomfortable. Um, to just kind of announce it that way. But somehow, if you do a song and dance number with a little bit of vaudeville style and wink, wink, everyone's laughing along with you, but they're not realizing that we're just hammering home this message that everyone, the hero and the villain of every story, um, the sailor who battled a full force gale, that's a tongue twister lyric I wrote. So that sailor who survives the big storm, he makes it through, but he still dies in the end. He just doesn't die in that storm, right? So that's the message of that particular song. It's a challenging one when we engage in it without the laughter or the music. So, which brings us to the point of this series, right? That through the fun and liveliness, sometimes comedy, but sometimes drama and so forth, of theater, of music, of movies, we're going to be able to engage with some challenging topic matter in the area of death, dying, grief, right, Karen?
Right.
And using this good cultural stuff, we'll be able to engage in some challenging conversations. But hopefully with enjoyment and pleasure along the way. What do you say?
Exactly, which is kind of one of the secrets of living life well, is to be able to hold joy even when you're going through the hardest, most difficult times of life. Because if you can hold both of those realities, then you're making the best of what life has to offer. But and also my goal for our series is that we remind people to use the lens of death, dying, and grief when you look at popular culture, because it can give you some great topics to talk about and a great way to introduce those subjects to other people in your life to help them become a little more comfortable and becoming aware of the fact. Like, for example, today we're going to talk about Hamilton, and almost nowhere,
Mega-Broadway hit.
mega Broadway hit. Almost nowhere do I see people talking about the role that grief plays in this story in Alexander Hamilton's entire life. But wow, it's a powerful lens to view this story through, and could make for a great conversation. Great conversation for us, but for other people to have also.
For sure, for sure. And I think Hamilton is a great example of what I often say when people kind of cringe at my topic. I say, look, even big hits like Hamilton deal with a lot of tough stuff. I'll also mention in the same point a play like Fun Home or Next to Normal, which deals with, let's say, coming out late in life and suicide for Fun Home. Next to Normal deals with mental illness and delusion and all that stuff. Both were um, critical darlings. I think Fun Home won the Pulitzer, so did Next to Normal, um, and did well enough to be commercial hits. I mean, Fun Home was a small hit. You know, you're not going to do Les Mis type stuff with a play like that. But even Les Mis, which was a juggernaut, if you pay attention to that one, oh man,
Yeah.
true to its source material, the big French novel, there's a lot of heavy stuff in that one. But we'll save Les Mis for another
Well,
episode. Today
that'll
we're
be
doing
an,
Hamilton.
yeah,
How should
yeah.
we start, Karen?
Well, let me think. I kind of wanted to talk about grief as being a theme throughout Hamilton's entire life, because he was an orphan. He was orphaned at a
Yep.
pretty young age. And it comes up a lot in the musical, the fact that he's an orphan and really had to kind of raise himself and uh, be resourceful. And then he came to the US as an immigrant And
That's right.
it's a remarkable story, which I think is why Lin-Manuel Miranda chose his life to feature, because
Hmm.
it's a very interesting story.
To be sure. And if I think as we have this conversation, we'll reference tracks so our listeners and viewers can sort of play along at home. So I'm going to say that our opening track will be track number one, Alexander Hamilton, which is our opening number. And it sets the table of this important character's backstory and his entrance to New York City, which is really where the play begins. So, as you said correctly, Karen, he is an orphan, um, bastard, as his his parents were unmarried, and an immigrant because he was not like unlike many of the signers, the founding fathers who were blue bloods who had been several generations in colonial America. He was sort of fresh off the boat, and throughout the play, um, the fact of his illegitimate birth, the fact of his immigrant status, all of that are used as insults against him. Um, but there's also kind of a darkness. You described grief, and I would say grief and death as a framing of the play. I think of grief as the painful feeling of loss associated with something you don't have anymore. So usually looking backwards. So we see in the play grief for his homeland, right? He had to leave as a child. Maybe grief for the parents that are absent, for sure. Um, and I think even as the story advances, um, at one point when he's kind of in a intellectual tussle with Washington, I'm jumping ahead a bit. He complains that he doesn't have what you have, meaning like almost he's grieving for the background he doesn't have because his whole peer group, but by force of his wildly powerful intellect, he rode his way out of the storm, as we hear in Hurricane. He is in the room where it happened, right, for a different
Yeah,
song.
yeah.
um but his background, that sort of triple hex against him or mark against him, son, illegitimate child, immigrant, and essentially poor, all three of those might be a cause for him to feel like he doesn't belong or he's missed out on something for the rest of his life.
Yeah, like he was constantly trying to rise above those, and there was really no solution in a way for the pain of those three things. He carried it with him, and I think it affected everything that he did.
That's right. He did carry the pain forward. Yeah, a lot of anger too, which we might see anger slash temper slash impulsiveness as some of the flaws that undo him as the story goes on.
Yeah.
Um, the I was asking my wife and daughter, who are also fans of the show, um, and Dahlia noted, shout out to my smart 13-year-old who loves Hamilton and probably can sing it word for word from beginning to end. Um, she noted that when Hamilton becomes a war hero, his dear friend John Lawrence, who was the leader of the first Black Battalion, gets killed in battle. So um, we see survivor's guilt live on
Hmm.
stage. That's a certain subset of grief for all those lucky veterans who make it home alive. They're all grieving for their buddies who got killed, and they often have complicated grief because they're guilty that they serve, but for stepping this way onto the landmine or that way into the shelter,
Yeah.
could have been them.
That's such a
And
good observation. That's so true.
yeah, I think that haunts Hamilton from the beginning, that it's like This is quick little acknowledgement of white privilege. One of the best explanations that I've ever been given of what is privilege is the quantity of mess ups you're allowed to make
Mm.
before you have to really pay for it in a way that hurts. And um, in a sense, the fact that Hamilton rose as fast and as high as he did, despite those challenges, it's spectacular how he managed to keep avoiding the literal bullets and the proverbial bullets of of all that was going on as he did his dizzying ascent. Though later in the play, um, his wife, who was lamenting his death, said like you flew too close to the sun. That was when she was grieving for their lost marriage and their love. Um, so he
Uh,
wanted to go high and be a star, but that's a when I use that phrase dizzying ascent, I think of the brave mountaineers who risk life and limb to get to that high point. And we know that some people die on the way up the mountain. That is a theme throughout Hamilton, that he is on his way, but for the controversy related to him messing around with another woman, he might have become a president. I
yeah.
mean, he was that good, but boy, did he moved fast and he did end up flying too close to the sun.
Yeah, and that's such a good metaphor for it, that rapid ascendancy, but without any limits, without being able to kind of filter himself or set boundaries for himself. Um, he went for everything he could and then ended up crashing in the end.
Right. So there's a song called Non-Stop, which describes his professional ascent, and it's narrated by his then friend and later infamous enemy, Barr, Burr, sir. Yes, Aaron Burr, not Barr,
Er,
Burr, um, who marvels at the speed with which this man can write and how ambitious he was. Um, you know, I hear that song as a person of great ambition, and I have my dreams with the play and other creative things I think about. And sometimes I watch other people doing their thing, especially in the performative world that is Facebook and Instagram, where everyone's showing their best selves and their proudest achievements all the time. And one can easily get into that place of being kind of mad or resentful at other people's success, what the kids
mhm.
would call hating. Um, and I think Hamilton's rivals see his ascent and they're all like, "Ooh, who's this guy?" And they say like, "Who does he think he is?" Um, Sometimes we get into that as we watch other people with great success, and we can feel jealous or angry or resentful. Um, but um, he he was kind of an iconoclast, and he was just doing it, man. He was running ahead. Um,
I think
and
it
it
was
was
also his pain that was driving him in some ways, his pain and
Well,
grief,
let's talk about that
always trying to prove
because that's
himself.
something I can relate to personally. But say more, doctor.
Just that always trying to prove his worth and prove that he deserves to be here, that he deserves to have anything come to him because he started from nothing and had lost everything, and that he could never feel himself to be worthy. He was constantly proving it and really trying to prove it to himself, I think.
Hmm. I think that's a great insight, and one that I can relate to. I think a lot of is it overachievers? Maybe if I'll speak from my own personal experience, and if it resonates with you, dear listener, you can nod. Otherwise, let it go. um, but a lot of times when I'm seeking validation from others, certainly as a performer, look at me, cheer for me. As a teacher, children, be quiet and listen to me. Even in my former life as a cantor, like in many cases, it's like everyone be quiet so I can pray on your behalf. There's a theme here of me wanting to have my voice heard and and also for everyone to be looking and listening. I think part of that might just be my personality, but part of it may also be an old story of me not feeling seen or heard as a child
Hmm.
and then like overcompensating in all kinds of ways for the rest of my life. Now, I having enjoyed a lot of interviews and podcasts where creative people and performers talk about their craft, I recognize this biographical theme of, especially among like comic performers talking about being the youngest or real trying hard to get dad's attention or mom was a drunk but if I could make everyone laugh it was okay, and they're different stories, right? But to me the essential truth is doing something, whether it's entertaining or in the case of Hamilton writing prodigiously or speaking 1,000 words when 100 would do. That's the whole joke with his first lawyering appearance. It's it's doing extra or being extra to overcompensate, perhaps,
Hmm.
for a feeling of not belonging, or as you said a moment ago, not feeling worthy enough. We identified this theme in young Alexander Hamilton's life that he escaped a hurricane when it killed others, and he escaped the island when others were stuck there, and he escaped danger when his friend got killed. And all of these moments of pivot where his pivot was the lucky one, um, in a way, it's like a blessing and a curse to feel like you're chosen. Just to go biblical for a second, if I may, Mr. Cantor. Just yesterday, I was teaching for the Yom Kippur service, a family service. This is the Day of Atonement for Jewish people, comes in September or October. And one of the famous biblical texts we read is the Jonah story. And there's this whole theme of the reluctant prophet, because Jonah gets called by God to go do a mission, and Jonah's like, hard pass, I don't want to do it. And God shows that God's the boss by sending the storm and the fish, and we know the story. But even after all of that, Jonah still is a somewhat reluctant servant of God. It brings up a lot of interesting questions because if you are, I guess I'm presupposing a lot of belief here, but let's just go with the big story that this is a chosen man who has to do a holy mission. This is Jonah, not Hamilton, but I'll bring it back to Hamilton in a minute, I promise. Um, Jonah is not ready to take God's orders and essentially nearly pays for it with his life. And then he gets a chance of holy redemption and tries again with mixed results. In a sense, Hamilton narrowly escapes death not once, but several times on his way to young adulthood. And then, despite the fact that he dies as a youngish man in the duel that would kill him, right? It's almost a wonder he made it that long, given the life he lived. So, and there are some moments when I wouldn't call Alexander exactly a religious man, but to cue up your favorite song,
Hmm.
Quiet Uptown, that song to me sounds a little bit like a prayer.
Hmm.
Do you want to highlight why that song was meaningful to you?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the event that came beforehand, which is when Alexander Hamilton's, I think it's his oldest son, like his first child, Philip, at the age of 19, died in a duel. Again, duels being so far outside of what I can fathom as a way of solving a conflict, but that they used to happen. And his son participated in a duel and died as a result of the gunshot wound. And I think in the musical, it depicts Alexander as telling his son to just raise the gun in the air as a sign that you're not going to shoot, and then the other person won't shoot you. But he gets shot anyway and ends up
Right.
dying, and it's so absolutely devastating.
Oh, it's heartbreaker every time.
Yeah, well, I mean, as any parent can feel that pain, but for Alexander, I
Every
think this
parent's worst
son,
nightmare is to bury their child, right?
yeah, and this son Philip, there's a song that he and Aaron Burr both sing about their first child being born.
Dear
That's
Theodosia,
Yeah, which is so lovely. And so,
beautiful
like this
song.
child meant so much to Alexander Hamilton, and then to have his son die in a duel. And I think in the duel, he was actually defending his father's honor, if I
Correct.
remember correctly.
He
And
died
so,
defending his father's honor.
yeah. And so,
Talk about complicated
oh, yeah, doubly
grief
devastating.
for the father.
Totally totally complicated grief. And so I really think that event kind of ended his ascendancy. Like he was not able to recover from that really to
No,
do anything to do anything else. I think he continued to write, but that really um impacted him so much. And so there's this gorgeous song called It's Quiet Uptown, which this
yeah.
song just like brought me to tears immediately and spoke to me because the lyrics are so lovely. And well, it talks about they're trying to
Read,
do the
yes, read us a few couplets.
okay. um, all right. Well, first of all, like Alexander and Eliza kind of withdrew from society. Actually, they were separated then, right? And they
Right.
with
They'd been going through marital troubles.
yeah, before the death of Philip, and then so it's quiet uptown because they moved uptown out of the public eye in a sense in order to grieve. And so there's a chorus that says, or this is a bridge, I guess. There are moments that the words don't reach. There is a grace too powerful to name. We push away what we can never understand. We push away the unimaginable. And I guess that word unimaginable rang so true for me of even trying to imagine what that pain must be like, and that it's the most horrific thing that ever crosses my mind, the pain of losing a child, that I always push away. I always push it out of my mind. I don't want to go there and think of that. It's imaginable. And anyway, that part of the song was really moving to me. And
I, I find that song very beautiful and impactful as well. Um, Even though I know the story well, I find it surprising each time that the couple comes together over their grief. We know in real life, unfortunately, so many um, relationships, serious relationships, and marriages break up related to child illness and child loss because it's such an incredible stressor on the relationship, especially if the relationship is on a shaky foundation already. But even if it's a healthy marriage, you hear a lot about everything going south when a child dies.
yeah,
Um, so that's just a thought I had. The other thing is we mentioned complicated grief. The teacher in me wants to say define the term there. Complicated grief might be understood as grief wherein an aspect of the loss is doubly complicated because of the circumstances. Here are some examples. The death of someone who you didn't like or didn't love, despite them being close to you, um, like the death of a rival or the death of a jilted lover or something like that. That might be complicated grief. When a loved one has died by suicide, that's always complicated grief because you love them and miss them and you're angry that they did that. Um, so and sometimes if you feel partially responsible for the death of another person, your guilt gets messed around, or entwined with all of the normal feelings of grief, resulting in complicated grief. So when we think of the character on stage, Mr. Hamilton, he's thinking that one of his dying son's last words is like, "I did what you told me to, Dad." And he's like, I know, it's okay." And then his son dies and he's wrecked. And you imagine he must be thinking as he walks around Harlem back when it was the countryside, and um, thinks he was listening to what I told him about how to have a duel, and it killed him.
Yeah. And
That's
as
complicated grief.
Yeah, you talked about all of those examples throughout Hamilton's life when he's the one who had the lucky twist of fate and other people around him suffered from something that he had been able to avoid,
Yes.
and the survivor guilt that he probably felt, cumulative survivor guilt throughout his life from those events, and then his very own son dies defending him and doing what he taught his son to do in the duel, thinking it would protect his son.
Yeah. One type of grief that we haven't named yet that is important. Again, this time, hat tip to my smart wife. It's grieving for a job that is lost or an opportunity lost. So, if you think about Hamilton's trajectory, those of you listening who know it, he was on a fast track, possibly to the American presidency, certainly to be a cabinet official again. I mean, he was a cabinet official in the Washington administration. Um, but his scandal with the Reynolds papers, sort of whatever strange move he made there, um, we can fault him for both, the fact that he was cheating on his wife, having this affair, and we can also fault him for the foolish choice to publicize it. It's very quizzical. With our hindsight, we can judge him easily. However, let's remember that the man, in doing that, his biggest hope to be the American president was dashed. When his son died, he grieved his son, and like every parent of a dead child, they spend the rest of their life grieving the person that they never become. Especially when their peer group becomes, say, grandparents, and there's no next generation because the child has died, or I'll never see
Yeah.
him grow to marry or have children, that kind of thing. So I imagine that Mr. Hamilton, as he grows and carries this heavy burden of grief for his dead son, I imagine he was grieving for the life that he didn't get to see, with his son, and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. And I wanted to say, musically, about the musical, that I thought what Lin-Manuel Miranda did with depicting this grief was really beautiful and brilliant, because this song is a quiet song with beautiful harmonies in it, and
Yes.
less of the rap lyrics like that we'd seen in other songs. So
Right.
it was really set apart, and he allowed it to have its own special space and kind of a pause in a way for all the audience to take this in. And that's why it's like the emotion just overwhelms you
Mm,
in that moment. I think listening to that, and it's a beautiful song, quiet, and you just see Alexander and Eliza kind of, you see them coming together by the end of the song,
yes.
and touching hands, and that's the moment of forgiveness when they're able to connect again and help each other. Anyway, I don't know what you thought of that, but I thought that was a really
I
beautiful moment.
I like that insight about the music, and I teach my students in music class. I teach general music to young kids, that part of the big power in music usually happens with contrast, right? It's the big climax and then the pulling back. Or in the case of a musical like Hamilton, it in, they intentionally try to switch styles, tempos, voicings. Is it a solo number? Is it ensemble? Is it up? Is it down? Is it fast? Is it slow? Is it loud? Is it soft? So the handful of quiet songs in Hamilton are often cited as crowd favorites. Another one you mentioned in passing is Dear Theodosia, that unexpected duet where you see both young fathers, the soon to be rivals, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, singing essentially the same song for their respective baby children. And it gives you a moment of like kind of sweet sentimentality,
Mhm.
where we're not being dazzled by the bombast of his words or the accompanying like power of the hip hop groove that comes with it. Um, it's definitely a beautiful moment. I'm also thinking about our topic. You know, w- this is not a music episode per se, but there's music aspects, right? And when I
Mhm.
think about music that goes with death, dying, and grief, we typically think of quiet first because that's sort of where a lot of the sad music sits. But there's also historically and in the here and now a lot of powerful loud stuff around this. Think of like the big requiems where, a requiem is a song for death, right? It's funeral music, but it's the pulling out every stop on the organ. It's a choir blasting full voice with eight parts. I'm remembering and getting kind of goosebumps when I was freshman year in one of the top church choirs in the country. Yes, Jews sometimes sing in a church choir, especially for course credit. And we did some serious big works, Karen. This was a top choir at Northwestern University, and including a couple of requiems along the way. Really difficult stuff and so dramatic, especially when performed full voice with, combined choirs. We're talking 80, 100 voices and orchestra. So, like, you can do that classically. And then you can also, just a couple weeks ago, I did a very bizarre music podcast where the conceit was fun. The bizarre was the album, and I'll explain. We were exchanging music recommendations and then talking about it, right? So because I was guesting and talking about my show, we did a little bit of musical theater, and then just to like throw us a curveball, one of the co-hosts gave us a death metal album, which to me was mostly unlistenable. It was really challenging. So I said, well, I gotta say something thoughtful, right? So I got the lyrics off of Spotify. You can get the lyrics scrolling. It was so dark. And it was loud and it was angry and it was raw. And then I thought about it and I was like, I'm not gonna pick listening to this kind of music like for fun. However, as the conversation ensued, the guy who recommended it said, my 13-year-old self stayed alive because of music like this. And I was just blown away, Karen. This is stuff that to me, I mean, we were laughing about it because the lyrics, if you found it written in a kid's notebook, you'd send them to the school counselor worried about their safety. But all joking aside, a lot of kids who are struggling, they love stuff like that. It doesn't mean that they're going to do something awful, but they like hearing their anger and upset about things like death and dying.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an outlet for it, but at the same, that's what grief is, this full spectrum from the loud,
The
angry
loud, angry to the
emotion that we
quiet
have, and then
tears.
the quiet, yeah, the whole spectrum. And so that's a really good point. We need all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing that Hamilton does in particular as a kind of master class, so to speak, in musical theater writing is achieving such a spectacular range of sonic moments, as I was explaining, all those contrasts and all of these styles. I mean, it's it's kind of God smacking and head smacking, whatever you want to smack. Don't smack God. God might be vengeful. But it's unreal, the quantity of words in this piece of music, piece of theater, and the amazing range of styles. And you are so right, Karen, in terms of the range of feelings that grief brings to us. I think this is something that you and I, in our respective teachings about death and dying and grief, have tried to bring forth to our respective audiences, right? Is that it's it's almost like all of the feelings are correct
Hmm.
and acceptable, especially when we try to deal with them authentically and in relatively healthy slash productive ways. Productive maybe is the wrong term, but like we know that grief is a beast. And we see it on stage with our friend Alexander Hamilton as he's walking the streets of Harlem in that beautiful haunting song. And also we kind of see him walking, he's like literally walking and metaphorically walking through the grief journey.
Yeah.
I like to teach that if you're physically able to, walking is one of the best ways to move through grief for all kinds of reasons. I think about grief moments in my life, and a lot of times for me, when I'm struggling with difficult emotions, being physically on the move is helpful. And then we can kind of access a little bit of that quiet, whether it's literally like walking to a quiet place, like a hike in the woods, or in the case of our hero Hamilton on stage, he's walking in a quieter part of the city when Uptown was quiet. Now Harlem is famously noisy. Having lived there for a year and a half with a baby, I can vouch to that. Um, though she learned to sleep through anything, so maybe that's good. Um, you know, there's one more song I think I want to highlight. I don't know how are we on time, but we were talking about different feelings with grief, and here's another great song, Complicated Grief. It's the angry um song sung by his spouse. Um it's in the second act. It's when she's burning the
Oh,
letters.
yeah. I was just going to bring that up too, because Eliza, she grieves as well. I mean, she's like a secondary character, but
Burn.
so important in
So
the
the song is
story.
called Burn. It's in the
Burn.
second act. In the original Broadway album, it's performed by the spectacular Philippa Sue, who, fun fact, took this role or got this role when she was still an undergraduate at Juilliard. So she was a young phenom and cast as the young wife at a moment when she was actually a young woman, has since had a wonderful career on Broadway and shows no sign of stopping. Um, anyway, she is on stage ripping up their love letters and burning them in a moment of erasure. Um, so many of their famous love letters, we only know part of the story because part of the letters were destroyed. Um, and then, of course, it's a symbolic moment of saying our marriage is done. It turns out they do have an eventual reconciliation, but in that moment, she's furious because her husband has just publicly humiliated her by telling the world about his affair. And this would be when she's grieving for a relationship. Um, Dear listener, think about the last time you had a breakup where your heart was broken, whether it was a divorce or boyfriend, girlfriend, or sorry, any romantic relationship of any gender pairing. Let's be gender expansive. Yay, Pride. We're going to Pride when we're done with this recording today, with my family. Uh, anyway, when we think about those relationships, when we had the breakup, it usually involves a lot of hurt,
Hmm.
right? Whether you're the dumper or the dumpy, whether you were the cheater or the cheated. I mean, the matters of the heart, we all know, are no joke, as the kids say, right? The
Yeah.
feelings are such real things, to quote Frida B. You and me. And we see it on stage in this moment where she is just devastated and you feel it for her. I think, especially if you're a woman or a person who's been cheated on, you might cry through that song. Um, but I also just kind of think about it in terms of any time you're dealing with this stuff from a relationship or a former marriage, if you get a divorce or split up or something, like a lot of times there's like that box of mementos. um I'm not sharing a total secret here. My wife probably knows that this box exists somewhere, possibly at my parents' house. There's like a tiny box of mementos
Hmm.
for like a relationship that is like way in the rear view, not my current marriage, right? And I don't feel the need to like locate that box and destroy it. Like it just exists somewhere. And maybe at some point I'll get rid of it. Maybe I won't. But it also kind of speaks to the fact that that relationship ended not in intense acrimony, that I did not choose to destroy all that stuff. Like there are probably other relationships in the past. I'm not someone who like tends to destroy things, but I imagine, dear listener, if you're thinking, wait, which letters do I still have and which do I not? It's probably related to the circumstances around the breakup, right? So we watched that moment on stage of his wife um burning the letters. By the way, it's not just that she burns the letters, it's that he seduced her through his letters.
Hmm.
Their relationship, as was the custom in the olden times, was played out in a flirtation on pen and paper and led to their love. And then when they had like a long distance relationship for a while, when he was off doing a thing, and love letters and so forth, like um so it was sort of a sweet part of their romance. And so when she burns it, it's like that's all done.
Yeah. Which makes what we already talked about, the scene of
The later
reconciliation,
reconciliation, yeah.
so much more powerful, and the forgiveness that happens. And then the ending song with when Eliza and
Yeah,
rises
this
up and
this is where
actually,
we should end it, when she's dealing with being a widow. Go ahead.
yes, yes, as far as the last display of grief. And that's a really powerful song as well.
um who lives, who dies, who tells your story. That's the final
That's
number.
Oh,
Or
that's
the one
after
before that
that.
is the
The,
world was wide enough. That's when
um,
the two dead men are speculating if they needed to go out as they did.
yeah.
Um, that's
Um,
when we get a little bit of the magic of theater, you know.
then it's when Eliza's talking about what maybe it's I don't know. She's
I
talking
think it's
about
the final song.
what she did.
Correct us in the comments if I'm getting it wrong,
Yeah,
dear
because she
listeners.
outlived Alexander by so many
That's
years. I
right. And
think
she's
she
talking
lived,
about building the orphanage.
yes, in his honor. I mean, in
Yeah.
a way, like
I'm pretty sure
to
it's the last track, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story.
she went on. Yes, it is. Because she tells Alexander's story
Right.
in
By
the things that she
interviewing the
does.
men who served with him.
Yes, and then she
That's how
goes
we have
on,
part of this history.
she builds the orphanage, like
Yep.
she brings his whole life full circle in a way and gives meaning to everything that happened in his life, and really shows tremendous love for him still in spite of burning the letters. And I think in how she dealt with her widowhood and how she honored Alexander after his death.
It's incredible. That moment, um, you have to thank the amazing story, I guess, because if you get a thumbnail sketch of Hamilton, especially as he was known before this play helped us know him better, right? He was a character who was a little bit of an afterthought in terms of the founding fathers because he died young, because he never became president, and he was known as the guy who got killed in a duel. I mean, and Burr, equally important founding father, became the guy who killed Hamilton
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
right. Um, as Burr sings, an asterisk in your history or something, an
Hmm.
anecdote in your history, afterthought in your history, something like that. But both of them had loftier ambitions that they didn't quite realize. Um, but certainly for Hamilton, we know about him because his wife, in her grief, chose to, how do you say it, ride that grief for action. Um, this may sound a little bit self-help, but forgive me. Sometimes I like that genre. Um, so sometimes a difficult feeling is a signal for action. The first time I heard this was anxiety is often a signal for action. Like, I'm nervous about the test, I'm feeling anxious. Oh, that's a signal I should study or prepare, right? Um, and I think grief gives us feelings in all kinds of ways. We already identified it earlier in the conversation as like this umbrella of feelings related to loss, right? And for many of us, that loss can be so debilitating as to leave us with feeling like we are a shell of ourselves. Maybe that's the first part of the It's Quiet Uptown, when Hamilton and his wife kind of retreat from the world. Um, and sometimes grief looks like healing and reconciliation. Second part of that song. Sometimes grief looks like a call for action,
Hmm.
right? So we know that the widows of every war have often become activists for peace, or they've become activists for better nursing or public health. I mean, in every generation, it's often the women who are grieving their men. I'm sorry to be gendered, but this is just a historical thing, who have said, like, we need better nursing, we need better hospitals, like, so we can take care of our boys, our men, and so forth. In a sense, um, Eliza Hamilton is a paradigm of this, right? She was devastated first by the loss of her young son in a duel, and then tragically her own husband in another duel. And she ends up being an activist for all of these humanitarian causes, including the care of orphans, which you can imagine was not a typical fancy person cause. But think about it. So many times, I'm going to use that funny new phrase again. So many times, the fancy people causes are related to their personal experiences. We know, you and I both, that people who fund hospice in major ways are often loved ones of people who've gone through a hospice journey during their end of life care, or like, I know one of the first friends I lost, he died of muscular dystrophy. So his family happens to be wealthy, and you better believe they've given a shit ton of money, pardon my French, to various causes related to muscular dystrophy because they have the resources and because they've lost a couple of sons. Um, so a lot of philanthropy, and philanthropy, I guess, acting through money and giving, and activism acting through political engagement, is born of grief and loss.
Hmm.
Um, I want to highlight one more example. My dear friend Bert Hughes, a music teacher who I loved very much, died about a year ago. And he's always been a role model of mine, and I've been invoking him and his memory again and again. I dedicated my performance at Charm City Fringe in his memory, and I I was struck at his, I guess we would call it a memorial service, which was overflowed. So many people loved him. Teacher friends, former students, community activists we worked with, and people loved him so much. And of course, in his name, in his memory, lots of money was raised, lots of people recommitted to volunteer and kind of carry on in his memory. Um, Returning finally to the play, I think Eliza is modeling that, living a life of activism and dedication in honor of her husband, that fallen loved one.
Yeah. Which is like it's a really nice way to end the play and then for us to come to an end in our discussion too with this
Yes.
kind of full circle look. But to me, the Hamilton becomes so much richer when I add in this lens of looking at grief while I'm watching Hamilton and being aware all the time of, oh, there it is, there it shows up, look, there's more grief. That's I just find it a really, I mentioned it before, a good lens to look through, but it's kind of a character. It's a grief is a driving force in the story itself. And so I hope our listeners find it valuable for us to talk about this, but that it changes the way they watch and listen to things in the future too themselves.
Yeah, speaking of listeners, I think we ought to leave our listeners and viewers with a couple of questions that you guys can jump in on the comments, whatever platform you're watching on, or you can contact us directly via the various
Yeah.
contacts we will give you later on. But one is, if you like Hamilton, which of those songs that we mentioned today speak to you and why? We highlighted the opening number. We highlighted It's Quiet Uptown. We talked
Dear
about Burn.
Theodosia.
We talked a little bit about Dear Theodosia, um, and a few others. Hurricane, I think, came up in passing. So let us know in the comments which of those songs are favorites, or if we missed any that deal with death, dying, grief that we forgot to list. I mean, it is a musical in our defense, Karen, with over 30 songs. So we
Yes.
couldn't get them all. So tell us in the comments. And then maybe if our conversation today resonated with you as a fan of the musical Hamilton, a viewer of the show on stage, or even in the fabulous movie version, I want to mention parenthetically, if you've never seen Hamilton, please, if you can afford it, see it on stage. If not, if you can get Disney Plus or you know someone who has Disney Plus, they have the so-called movie version, which they shot over, I believe, 4 days in New York City and then spliced together the best
Yeah.
stuff. So
And
that's a cool thing you can check out.
if you can do both, because seeing it live on stage will change your life. It is so powerful. Then
Amazing
you can
show.
go back and you can watch the movie over and over and over again and
Yep.
relive that moment that you had in the theater. And so
Good
it's
suggestion.
really great to take it in both ways. I hope everyone has already seen it, or if they will, go out immediately and watch it if they haven't,
Watch it or listen. It is
or
super
listen.
rich to listen to, and
That's
that's
true.
probably going to be the easiest thing to get your hands on right away. Um, you know, on Spotify or wherever you stream your music. That was an unpaid plug. Um, but it is incredible work to be sure, and so much more the than the American Revolution hip hop style.
Yeah.
So thanks for an amazing conversation, Karen. I loved it.
Yeah, thank you.
And do we know yet what our next conversation is, or are we not
No,
going to tell our listeners?
we don't know for sure yet.
So,
We
based on our lack of planning, dear listeners, we will not tell you today what it is. But here, a third piece of comment inducing question. Do you have a favorite musical that you think we should talk about that deals adeptly or beautifully with death, dying, and grief? Put it in the comments or send us messages. We love to hear from you
That's
guys.
that's great.
And even when I'm not co-hosting, keep listening to Karen's amazing show, End of Life University. But if you listen when I'm here too, I won't argue with that.
All right. Well, as always, Ben, it's been so much fun. Thank you.
Thanks for having me along.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation about the musical Hamilton with Ben Kintish. We have lots of plans for future episodes, so you can tune in whenever we do another one of these pop culture episodes. And I'll be back next week with another new interview for you. And until then, take care. Bye bye.